You're about to watch a trial guide unlike anything you have ever experienced in your time playing the Elder Scrolls Online. This video is going to give you an absolutely comprehensive, in-depth look at every single mechanic, every relevant part of every single fight, and multiple strategies on how to deal with all of the mechanics coming with the brand new trial Sanity's Edge. Now, I've obviously sectioned off this video into the different encounters that you'll come across, but each of those encounters are also broken up into two sections. The first half of each will give you an in-depth look at every single mechanic that every boss and every relevant ad performs, and the second half will put all of that information to use, developing strategies to help you succeed in your efforts to clear Sanity's Edge, whether it be on regular vet, hard mode, or even the Trifecta. A quick word before we get started, my friends. This video is sponsored by Bethesda. To get access to Sanity's Edge, check out the link in the description to get your hands on the brand new chapter Necrom so that you can dive straight into this brand new trial. Alongside that link are a plethora of resources, including a link to a Discord, which includes my own written guide, an admittedly much prettier written guide done by the one and only Nelandia on ESOU, as well as a link to a variety of POVs from people who have already achieved the Trifecta in this trial. We have no time to waste, so let's get into it. The very beginning of the trial encompasses 4 main ad types to be aware of, totaling 6 or 7 individual pulls, including a mini-boss. The Butcher ad type is a dual-wield melee ad with just under 4 million health. Its primary attack reads as Weeping Slash, which also applies bleeding and snares to the player hit by it. Its heavy attack is called Butcher, and it applies the same heavy attack debuffs as some of the ads and bosses in VDSR. As a quick refresh to this heavy attack mechanic, Seethe is applied to the Butcher if you roll dodge the attack, which is essentially an enrage buff, as the Butcher's damage will increase by 60%. Rattled and Hindered are applied to the player if they block the heavy attack. Rattled decreases damage done by 70% and increases damage taken by 40%, and Hindered is the blue heal check that appears on your health bar. This prevents players from being able to restore health until a threshold of healing, typically based on max health, is applied to the debuffed player. Devitalized occurs if the player survives the attack without blocking or roll dodging. This debuff reduces the player hit's armor by 60%. Increases damage taken by 30%, and decreases strength and damage shields by 30%. The next mechanic, Tectonic Fissure, are small AoEs placed by the Butcher in an X-shaped pattern. Though these AoEs aren't initially dangerous, the damage ramps up very quickly if you stand in them, so make sure you move out of these AoEs quickly. The Butcher also has a mechanic called Ember Chain, where he will randomly pull 2 group members toward him. This mech doesn't have much relevance outside of being a mild inconvenience. The Butcher's final mechanic is called Fiery Totem, which he spawns at the start of a fight. This totem lasts for 10 seconds and will spew fireballs at your group, but the damage isn't very intense, so this mech can be ignored. The second priority ad to be aware of is the Enforcer, or the Archer type ad, having roughly 2.5 million HP. This is one of the more dangerous ads in a trash pull and is a priority target over all but one ad type that appears in the second set of trash. Its light attacks happen very quickly and is a 2-shot to non-tank players, so it's essential that this ad is a priority taunt by the tanks. One of the first main mechanics this ad will do is teleport. Any Enforcer, after a few seconds into a fight, will teleport to a new location, which will typically dictate the stack point. Static Rain happens about 15 seconds into the pull and can often be skipped with good damage. This mechanic is extremely comparable to that of the Ash Titan in Veteran Rockgrove. The Enforcer will turn its bow to the air and begin firing a series of projectiles. There are 2 main AoE types, one small AoE that surrounds and follows a player, and much larger AoEs that appear on the ground. The smaller AoE will encompass a series of ticks, roughly 1.5 to 2 seconds apart from each other, that can be blocked. As opposed to perma-blocking during this mech, it's advised that you only feather block whenever the electric projectile looks like it's about to hit you, as perma-blocking will prevent you from being able to be mobile to handle the dangerous AoEs on the ground. Like Ash Titan, the AoEs on the ground that form are the real danger and should be avoided as a priority over feather blocking the AoE tracking you. Finally, the Enforcer will also do an Eagle Eye Shot, which looks like a taking aim type mechanic. This mech targets one player and shows the heavy attack animation on the player targeted. After about 3 seconds, the shot will fire. You can either block or roll dodge this mech, though the penalty for missing it is surprisingly not very severe. The Paranoxia is a Watcher type ad with about 2.5 million HP. This ad has a lot of cleave, so it's very important for it to be turned away from the group. and it's recommended that the group play somewhat ranged from this ad if possible. Doomtruth's Gaze is the typical Watcher mechanic where a line of beams spawn from the eye. It does a ton of damage and stuns targets, so it's really important to block this as a non-tank, especially if you get caught in the path of these deadly beams. Shockwave is the big AoE spin that pops up around the Watcher. This does a decent amount of damage and stuns if you are caught in it without blocking. Finally, Tentacle Burst is a giant AoE that cannot be blocked. The last elite ad to be aware of is the Wamasu. This target has roughly 3.6 million HP. As soon as an encounter with the Wamasu begins, it will target one random player. A growing AoE will appear under the Wamasu's feet that takes about 2 to 3 seconds to form. Once the AoE finishes, the Wamasu will charge towards the initial location that the targeted player was standing on initial targeting. This means that the Wamasu doesn't track a player's direction when the player moves, but rather charges in a straight line based on where the player was when the player was first targeted. Getting caught in the charge results in a pretty decent tick of damage, as well as getting thrown into the air, stunning the player for about 2 seconds, unable to break free. It's recommended that players hug any walls or barriers near the Wamasu's location, as running into an object will stop the charge. Failure to do so will cause the Wamasu to run pretty far away, and it takes a bit of time to pull it back into the stack. The charged headbutt mechanic is the Wamasu's heavy attack. This applies Seethe, Rattled, Hindered, and or Devitalized, depending on if the heavy is roll dodge, blocked, or unblocked. Finally, the Spiral Descender is a mini boss that spawns randomly during trash pulls, having roughly 17.6 million health. The mini boss can spawn before, during, after, or between trash pulls. Its basic attack is called Lacerate, and its heavy attack is called Raise, which also applies Seethe, Rattled, Hindered, and or Devitalized. The boss has a couple more attacks that hit the tank. Disrupting Splinter is a ranged projectile that hits the tank. Pervade is an attack from the boss that places a red haze around the tank, as well as inflicts a damage over time effect called Mind Rend that lasts for 8 seconds. Finally, its primary mechanic is called Frightening Grasp. The boss pulls all the players towards it and reduces all player health. The boss then puts a Baneful type debuff on each player, which significantly decreases healing received and doubles the cost of ultimates to any player inflicted. This debuff goes away once a player reaches full health, but continues to tick for ramping damage over time the longer the debuff is active. Simultaneously, a giant AoE will begin to form on the center of the boss. Even if you aren't out of this Baneful mechanic, you can block or roll dodge this AoE. The pull-in portion of the mechanic cannot be outranged, but the AoE element of it can be. The rune ability has 2 parts. The Spiral Descender attacks in a front-facing conal AoE approximately every third of a second over a 2.5 second period. At the same time, the mini-boss sends a series of AoEs in all directions. These AoEs do quite a bit of damage, so you really want to make sure that the boss is not facing the group here. Mini-boss also summons 2 types of ads whenever there is no trash pull active. The main mini-boss is the Spiral Incarnate, a Bone Goliath type ad. Its basic attack is called Quick Strike, its heavy attack appearing as Uppercut is called Thrash, and its main mechanic is called Waves of Fire. The ad swings its sword and hurls a wave of fire along the ground, which appears as a single AoE and moves in a straight line toward the target of the ability, hitting anyone in its path. At least 2 waves will be sent out, about 3 seconds apart. The second type of ad is the Spiral Shock, usually spawning in groups of 3. Its basic attack is called Bite, which also has a variation called Fire Bite that applies Hamstrung, decreasing movement speed by 60% for 5 seconds. It has an AoE conal that targets the tank called Flamethrower and lays AoEs on the ground called Burning Ground. Its main mechanic to be aware of though is the Combustion Mech. Once the shocks are under about 25% health, they will explode, doing significant damage to anyone inside. Taking multiple ticks of this via multiple shocks dying simultaneously can kill a non-tank, but this mechanic can also be skipped if the group's AoE is strong enough. Upon entering the trial, the first ad pack you'll see includes a Wamasu, an Enforcer, and a few small ads. The Wamasu should be directly behind the Enforcer, which is off to the right. In general, all ads should be stacked on the Enforcer, as this is the most difficult ad to kill due to the teleportation mechanic. The teleport location is always random, making preparing for this mech impossible. You can either try to burn the Enforcer before it ports, which is extremely difficult, or you can relocate when the Enforcer ports. Especially with the first pull, the Wamasu will usually charge right around the time the Enforcer teleports, so it's pretty easy to just relocate the Wamasu to the new Enforcer location once it finishes. The second pull involves a single Butcher initially seen off to the right, between a burning bonfire bush-looking structure and the burning tree, as well as a Paranoxia that spawns from a portal between the aforementioned burning bush and some crates. The Butcher should be taunted initially and brought to the Paranoxia spawn location. Make sure that the Paranoxia is turned away from the group here. There isn't really a priority target in this pull, just burn everything evenly. The third pull is quite the jog away and involves a roaming Paranoxia. I'd suggest pulling this ad on top of any staircase it's around, simply due to the way elevation severely disrupts skill casts in this game. While the third ad pull is being done, it's wise to send a tank to the fourth ad pull to begin the spawning animation. The pull contains one Enforcer and two Wamasus, but the Enforcer does a very large conal AoE that kills some NPCs as a part of the quest's dialogue. This large AoE will near one-shot a player, so it's best to let this animation play out before pulling. There's also a second ad pack on this bridge that you can optionally pull together. That pack contains a Wamasu, Enforcer, and Butcher. If you were to do these two pulls together, you would likely target the first Enforcer and try to nuke it before it teleports, or at least so that any dots will finish it off when it does the teleport. Allow all three Wamasus to charge, then stack the Wamasus and Butcher on the second Enforcer's location after it teleports. The timing should line up pretty well if the first Enforcer dies quickly, so that all charges in the second Enforcer's teleport all happen by the time the first Enforcer dies. However, this is a bit risky because if you get the mini-boss while doing this, the pull gets drastically more complicated. The much safer strat is to just pull these one at a time. The first pull would start with the stack on the Enforcer in the center, and then once it ports and the Wamasu charges, relocate to the Enforcer's new location. The second pull would work a similar way. The Enforcer appears on the right, followed by the Wamasu and Butcher behind the Enforcer, also on the right. Stack everything on the Enforcer, then relocate after the teleport and Wamasu charge. The final trash pull involves an Enforcer to the left of the staircase, a Butcher to the right of the staircase, and a Wamasu in the middle between them. Again, everyone should target the Enforcer, bringing the Butcher and the Wamasu to the Enforcer's initial location, but relocate once the Enforcer teleports and Wamasu charges. Remember, it's always helpful for the Enforcer to die in any pull, but if it's focused before the teleport, you can begin focusing the other two ads so that everything dies at roughly the same time, as opposed to finishing off the Enforcer, then finishing off the other ad. Finally, again, the mini-boss can spawn randomly before, during, after, or even between trash pulls. As a general rule, if you've already started a trash pull and the mini-boss spawns, finish the trash pull and attempt to bring the mini-boss into the already placed cleave. Otherwise, the safest thing you can do is kill the mini-boss separate from trash pulls. Attempting to do them together is more than possible, it's just a lot of targets for the tanks to get a hold of, and can result in some variable intense situations. The mini-boss is very simple, just stack and burn. If ads spawn, ignore them and focus the boss. The off-tank can just hold them and cleave. When the mini-boss pulls everyone in and gives them essentially baneful, you can opt to stay in and block or roll the giant AoE or get out of it. It won't make a difference one way or the other. Remember, if there is no active trash pull, the Spiral Descender will spawn some mini ads. These shouldn't need any focus or attention and can simply be cleaved. Just keep an eye out for those shocks, as getting caught in multiple explosions can hurt quite a bit. The first boss is not the easiest, but also not the most difficult fight in the entire trial. It's a bit chaotic and extremely mobile, but once you know what's going on, it's not too terrible to manage. I'm going to first discuss all of the mechanics that each target in this fight does, then I'll discuss the additional mechs associated with hard mode, followed by strats for this fight for vet and vet hard mode. Starting with mechanics dealt by the main boss. Slash is the basic attack on any player with aggro. This attack applies a bleed from hemorrhage for 8 seconds. That seems to do damage based on the target's max health. Targets are also slowed by hamstrung, which reduces movement speed by 60% for 5 seconds. This attack has a target and tick function, meaning that if the tank loses aggro momentarily and the boss targets another player with this ability, but the tank reclaims aggro before the ability actually fires, the player targeted will still be afflicted by the dot and hamstrung debuff, despite not taking damage from the actual basic attack itself. One of 3 potential mechanics that can take place immediately as the fight begins. Chain pull targets and chains 3 group members, stunning them in place. The target must break free or they will be pulled in 2 seconds after being grabbed. The boss cannot be moved or do any mechs while somebody is chained. This mechanic seems to take place when people get beyond a certain range of the boss. Hamstrung strike is an extremely quick and deadly conal AoE that must be faced away from the group. Sometimes this is the first mech that the boss does, which can be really inconvenient because the tank has not yet had time to face the boss away from group. It is a one-shot to a non-tank. Anyone hit takes the armor shred debuff, which reduces armor for 5 seconds, and anyone not blocking will take the hamstrung debuff, decreasing movement speed by 60% for 5 seconds. The final attack that can take place at the start of the fight is Knife Blast. This mechanic isn't too terrible to be hit by on regular vet, but is almost always a guaranteed death on hard mode. A large AoE fills quickly around the boss. Once complete, the boss does a whirling blades type animation and hurls knives at anyone caught in the AoE. This can be blocked or rolled, but blocking it applies the hemorrhaging bleed to the target for 8 seconds, which ticks for a pretty decent bit of damage. Targets also become hamstrung. This occurs roughly once every every 15 seconds. Fully buffed, you can survive this unblocked even on hard mode if your healers are quick enough, but it's incredibly risky. Vengeful Strike is the boss's heavy attack. This applies Seethe, Rattled, Hindered, and or Devitalized. Perhaps one of the more dangerous mechanics in this fight, the Firebomb mech can be seen when the boss throws out some potions. You can track these potions to see where they land, and when they do, pretty large AoEs will spawn. Touching one of these AoEs will cause the player to take Ignite, which places a small AoE around the player, dealing ramping damage over time. The AoE works a lot like the Keel Cutter mechanic in VDSR, meaning that the fire can be spread to other group members. Doing so, especially on hard mode, is likely a death sentence for the group. It's essential to avoid these AoEs at all costs. You can roll dodge through them though without getting Ignite if you find yourself in a tricky situation. The boss tosses these bombs once every 25 seconds at the beginning of the fight, which progressively gets quicker as the boss's health decreases, spawning as quickly as once every 15 seconds and execute. As the fight progresses, the boss also begins to throw more fire bombs. At about 50%, you'll get 4 fire bombs, and at about 20%, you'll get 5 of them. This mechanic can somewhat be controlled by the tank, but still has a random element to it, since the bombs are primarily placed on the tank's location when targeted. If the tank moves away right before the boss begins the animation for fire bombs, they will be placed out of group with about an 80% success rate. There is still a little bit of randomness to this though, so if an AoE ends up in group despite a well-timed move from the tank should simply reposition the boss to the closest safe location that allows the group to freely damage the boss. The final mech performed by the main boss is Frost Bomb. This mech places a blue symbol above the head of the player targeted, as well as a growing AoE. When that AoE finishes, anybody caught inside will be encased in an ice fragment. While inside the cage, you have your health reduced to about 30%, take a small damage over time effect, and have your healing received reduced drastically. If you are not healed to full health within 8 seconds, you explode, resulting in your own death. This mech is very reminiscent of the ice cages from Loc hard mode in Sunspire, but with a healing debuff a bit more intense. Above 50% boss health, this mechanic only targets one player, but below 50% health, this mechanic will target 2 players. Frostbomb targets the closest player to the boss without aggro, so it's important to make sure that healers are not the closest player to the boss. Throughout the course of the fight, you will see 3 different types of adds. The most dangerous of these add types are the Wamasu's, having about 7.7 million health on vet and 13.4 million health on hard mode. A Wamasu will start with the boss at 100% and then spawn at 90, 70, 50, 30, 20, and 10%. The Wamasu's basic attack is called Bite. The Wamasu has a charge mechanic the same way the previous adds do, except getting hit by this on hard mode is a one-shot. The Wamasu targets the player at random. Remember, once the targeting is initially set, the Wamasu will charge towards that initial location, regardless of if the player moves from that point or not at any time. The AoE indicating the charge takes about 3 seconds to fully form, at which point the Wamasu will charge in a straight line until it either goes a certain distance or is interrupted by a barrier, such as a wall, for example. Anyone caught in that path will take significant damage and get thrown into the air and stunned on vet, or simply one shot on vet hard mode, including tanks. The charged headbutt is the Wamasu's heavy attack, which applies Seethe, Rattled, Hindered, and or Devitalized. Finally, a new mechanic with this add, Overwhelming Lightning, is a massive AoE lightning cone. This cone will initially appear without doing any damage, as the Wamasu is charging up this ability. A few seconds after the AoE appears, the cone will actually begin to tick for damage. It does a ton of damage to non-tank players and cannot be survived for very long. It lasts about 10 seconds, ticking every half second. Simultaneously, small lightning AoEs travel from the base of the Wamasu and hit players for a decent amount of damage. You should only actively attempt to avoid these AoEs if the Wamasu is enraged, as the enraged AoEs hit for a near one-shot. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter if you get hit by them or not. Keep in mind that the Wamasu doesn't like elevated surfaces, which there is a lot of in this arena, as they can occasionally cause the cone to spin out of control. As long as the off-tank has aggro, the cone should only spin while it is in its spawn animation and should retarget the tank before any damage begins. Worst case, roll for a second and it'll likely correct itself. A smaller add that spawns with every new Wamasu in groups of 4, the Contra Mage's Archer has about 300,000 health on vet and 500,000 health on vet hard mode. It only has 2 mechanics, one of which is Quick Shot, its basic light attack. The main attack to be aware of is True Shot. This is a taking aim type mechanic that cannot be blocked or roll dodged. It has to be interrupted. It is a straight one shot if you get hit by it. Players targeted with True Shot will have a red symbol pop up above their head, as well as a symbol above the archer targeting them. them. This lets a player know exactly which archer is targeting them so that they can get the interrupt if needed. Finally, the horror ads have 316k health on vet and vet hard mode and spawn in the portal. When the quote-unquote portal mech occurs, 4 archers will spawn and be made invulnerable by these horrors. Once a horror is defeated, the archer can be targeted. The big kicker is that invulnerable archers cannot be chained. The only mechanic that the horrors perform outside of this invul mech is Torment, where one small red cloud circles the horror. Coming into contact with these clouds will fear the player for a few seconds, forcing them to break free. This can occur to anybody in the arena, regardless of portal, and can be a real inconvenience to the tanks. Now that we've discussed all of the specific mechanics, I'd like to discuss the general fight mechanics and the flow of the fight. This fight is built heavily around percentage thresholds. As you see here in this chart, something happens at nearly every percentage marker. At 90, 70, 50, 30, 20, and 10. A new Wamasu plus 4 archers spawn. At 60 and 35%, the portal mech occurs, which spawns 4 archers made invulnerable by 4 horrors. At 80, 55, and 25%, the shrapnel mechanic occurs. This is a hard mode specific mech that we will discuss shortly. At 50%, the boss begins spawning 2 frost bombs and 4 fire bombs. At 25%, the boss begins spawning 5 fire bombs. Diving a bit deeper into the portal mechanic, it's a pretty straightforward concept. At 60 and 35%, the boss will begin spawning somewhat slowly 4 green AoEs on the outskirts of the room. These AoEs grant Vanton's clarity, which allows a player to see the horrors that spawn at the given percentage thresholds. Even though we are calling this a portal mechanic, it's best to think of this synergy as more of a vision. Players who take the vision are able to see the horrors and damage them, whereas the other 8 players can only see the red clouds circling the horrors that can stun them. Players in this quote-unquote portal mechanic are in the same room as everybody else and subject to all of the same mechanics. Likewise, players without the vision are still subject to being feared by the horrors. The player loses Vanton's clarity either on death or once dealing the final blow to a horror ad. If a player loses Vanton's clarity to death, the green circle that granted the buff will appear on their dead body, and the player may take it again once they res. However, if a player loses Vanton's clarity by dealing the final blow to a ghost, they will not be able to activate this buff for themselves again for about 2.5 minutes. This means you'll want 2 teams of 4 to handle the 2 portal mechanics. More about how to perform this portal mechanic in the strategy section. Finally, the differences between this fight on vet and vet hard mode are very few. As always, everything has more health with the exception of the horror ads, and everything hits a bit harder. The knife blast mechanic becomes practically a one-shot on hard mode. The Wamasu charge is a one-shot to everybody, including the tanks on hard mode. The ignite mechanic from touching a firebomb deals significantly more damage and is practically a wipe if spread to the group at the wrong time. The Wamasu AoEs from overwhelming lightning do much more damage, and the heal debuff from the frost bombs is a bit stronger. The only new mechanic added is shrapnel. At 80, 55, and 25%, the boss will form an AoE under her feet and begin throwing shrapnel at the group. This mechanic does a lot of damage per tick and ticks once every 0.3 seconds. The damage taken is very comparable to that of Maelstrom on Teleria hard mode and VDSR. This mech lasts for 10 seconds and can be blocked or roll dodged. Keep in mind though that you'll lose a lot of stamina very quickly, blocking a tick once every 0.3 seconds. Anyone who steps into the AoE around the boss will also receive damage from Furious Slash. The tank will have to stay in this AoE though, or the boss will move, which will result in the tank being chased by the boss that ultimately removes the tank from healing. Once the shrapnel at 25% occurs, this mechanic begins to operate on a 50-second timer, making it vital to nuke the boss from 25% to dead before shrapnel occurs again. For the actual strategies related to this first boss, there are quite a few possible ways to go about doing this fight. The fight strategy is pretty much the same between vet and vet hard mode, so I'll discuss the general fight strategy as a whole from the vet perspective and discuss how the added shrapnel mechanic should change the regular vet strat for hard mode. With that, there are essentially 2 main strategies to consider. I distinguish them as the safe and burn strat. If your goal is the trifecta, you can realistically do either and still pretty easily make the speedrun, so it's completely up to you and your group which you'd prefer. The fight strategy is pretty heavily based on Wamasu and portal spawns. The safest version of the strategy involves holding the Wamasu away from the boss and therefore away from firebombs, and just nuking each Wamasu and archer set as they spawn. This puts a little more pressure on the main tank and requires the group to split a little bit, putting 1 damage dealer full-time on the boss above 50% and 2 on the boss below 50% to ensure that that the healers don't get Frostbomb. It is quite a bit safer though, as you don't risk double sets of Wamasus and archers spawning. You don't have to worry about firebombs in group, and frostbombs are really easy to control, essentially ensuring that no other player can accidentally end up frozen with the targeted player. You would also want to stop damage at about 60 or 55% for the first portal, and at about 40 or 35% for the second portal, to allow portal teams time to finish their mechanic, and have all damage dealers focused on getting interrupts until the invulnerable archers can be killed. While the portal mech is occurring, since you stopped damage before 50 and 30%, the off tank shouldn't have a Wamasu active, and can taunt the 4 invuln archers that spawn with the portal and range stack them by running to opposite corners of the room. On regular vet, you could theoretically do this all the way through the 20% Wamasu and then commit on the boss, and ignore the one that spawns at 10%, as the boss will have less health than the new Wamasu anyway. The safe strat simply deals with adds as they spawn, prevents more adds from spawning during portal mechanics, and then allows for damage on the boss when no other priority exists. The burn variation on this strat is much more difficult and requires a few changes. Rather than holding everything apart, you would stack the Wamasus on top of the boss and simply cleave down the Wamasus while focusing the boss. This is possible for all Wamasus, but even with the burn strat, it's suggested that the first Wamasu be focused, because you only have 10% to burn this Wamasu as opposed to 20% for all the rest of them. You could opt to stack all of the Wamasus on boss, but then still hold damage at portal spawn percentages to ensure you don't get a Wamasu and 8 archers, with half of them being unchainable. Or you could fully ignore that element and push. If you do push past portal though and opt to have that many adds up on the field, it's strongly advised to have some support and maybe even a damage dealer run interrupts, as they will be going out constantly until portal is finished. This ad control element can be really tough, but if you can manage it, will significantly speed up your fight time. A couple of general miscellaneous strategies to keep in mind throughout the fight. Remember, the more your tank can position the firebombs out of group, the better off the group will be. This isn't 100% controllable, but is controllable most of the time, if your tank is able to anticipate the mech and start moving just before the boss begins the firebomb animation. For every portal mechanic, it's helpful to assign general quadrants for the portal team to grab their Vanton's clarity buff. However, these spawns work a lot like the orb spawns on the first boss in VDSR, being somewhat random along roughly 8 or 9 possible spawn locations. You'll have to adjust accordingly in a similar way. Once this buff is active, remember, you lose it once you deal the final blow to a horror. So rather than each portal DD individually going down and killing their own ghost, they should work together to get each of the targets low and then execute them all at once all the ghosts are near dead. Portal will finish much quicker this way. Finally, you're going to want a healer in the BRP resto to ensure that healing will be strong enough for the frostbomb mechanic. Generally, being targeted by this mechanic makes players extra vulnerable, so they'll want to somewhat back away from the boss. I've had it happen many times where the frostbomb AoE occurs, which brings your health down to 30% and stuns you, as a mechanic like Knife Blast occurs simultaneously, which results in a player death. You can't block or roll dodge Knife Blast straight into a mechanic that drops your health down to 20%. So if you don't move away from the boss, you put yourself in a very vulnerable position. You don't want to run around like crazy, as it is the job of those around you to get out of your ice circle, or they will get frozen as well. But you don't want to worry about avoiding other players, because you need to go where you need to go to live. Just don't bring your AoE to a tank, for example. Under 50%, try to stack this AoE as close as you can to other players with ice so that it's easier to heal. The AoEs themselves should overlap, but other player AoEs should not be touching your feet. The only thing that changes with these strats for hard mode is how you decide to handle shrapnel. Shrapnel typically happens only a couple of percent away from the portal spawn, and having a bunch of adds up during this isn't helpful, especially if a true shot is getting ready to take place. The safe strat for the first portal involves either pushing the shrapnel and stopping damage at 55% and then sending portal, or holding damage at 60%, doing portal, and then continuing to push the boss as normal. It doesn't really make a difference which you decide to do. I personally prefer to push to 55%, hold the portal for shrapnel, and then send them, as all 4 spawn locations will be clearly noticeable by the end of the mechanic. The safe strat near execute is a bit annoying. You'll want to do the 35% portal and stop damage completely there. Once the portal is complete, you can push the 30% Wamasu out and kill it. Then, once the Wamasu is finished, you can stack and prepare for the shrapnel at 25%. On hard mode, from this point on, it's a DPS race. You need to kill the boss before the 2 Wamasus and or shrapnel kill somebody else. It's a good idea for the tank to set 1 more firebomb before pushing to 25%, push damage through the shrapnel phase, and then have the tank immediately move away from the boss to place the next firebomb, as this mech will happen immediately after shrapnel. The reason for this is if you push to 25% and the boss does a firebomb right before shrapnel, you could get some unlucky RNG even if the tank performs this mechanic correctly, and relocating the boss during shrapnel to avoid a firebomb AoE just gets really dangerous dangerous. If done correctly, the boss should hardly have to move, and the group should try to kill the boss in 15 seconds before a third firebomb potentially forces the group to move again. The off-tank just needs to hold the 20 and 10% Wamasu away from group and watch for interrupts. Remember, it's vital to kill the boss before the next shrapnel, so at bare minimum, you have 50 seconds at this point to burn the boss from 25% to dead, which will only happen efficiently if the boss doesn't have to move. The trash packs following the first boss introduced 3 new elite type adds, including the most dangerous add in the trial. The Disruptor is an add that only holds 1 dagger, having about 3.5 million health. The Disruptor has 2 primary mechanics. Fulminating Flare targets 4 group members who don't have taunt and marks them with a red haze. This acts as a damage over time effect, which ramps up in damage for 10 seconds. Its primary mechanic, though, Vehement Preservation, calls an orange AoE to the ground centered around its body. Anything inside of the AoE will take 85% reduced damage, and any add inside of the aura will do 60% increased damage, including the Disruptor. It lasts about 15 seconds and is channeled after 10 seconds of combat. Once the circle expires, it will only be another 10 seconds until it is channeled again. The next elite add we see is a Griffin, having about 2.6 million health. Most of this add's attacks contain some element of cleave, so it's wise to keep it facing away from the group. Slashing Talons is its basic attack that also does have some cleave. Riposte is a very large cone that goes out, doing a decent bit of damage. Aerial Pounce targets a random player. This attack can be roll dodged, but if it hits, the player is knocked down and the Griffin begins tearing into them using Feast. Feast ramps up in damage over 2.75 seconds, ticking once every 0.25 seconds. Finally, the Voidmaster is a mage type add with about 3 million health. This add does the most damage out of any of our new friends, but is still not the priority target. The Voidmaster's heavy attack is called Bludgeon, and it applies Seethe, Rattled, Hindered, and/or Devitalized. After about 5 seconds into the fight, the Voidmaster targets 2 members of the group, and an AoE is placed at their location, which detonates 2 seconds later. Anyone hit by the AoE is snared for 4 seconds, and the AoE lasts about 20. While active, they may periodically send smaller AoEs in 8 directions. Standing in 1 AoE doesn't do much damage, and can be healed through, but standing in 2 will likely result in a death. About 12 seconds into the fight, the Voidmaster spawns 3 Reaper Hounds, each with about 850k HP. After 3 seconds, the Hounds charge a member in the group, detonating in an AoE called Fetch. This ability can do detrimental damage if unblocked. This trash pack also includes a Spiral Descender, which acts the same as in the first round of trash. In general, any pull with a Disruptor can be a little tricky and be done in one of 2 ways. Think of this add like a Bulwark in VKA, except instead of just making anything in its circle invincible, it also enrages them. If group damage is strong enough, you can tab target and focus the Disruptor before the enraged circle goes out, making each pull pretty easy. If group damage is not quite there, you will have to separate the Disruptor from the trash pack, kill the adds, then kill the Disruptor. As a quick note, these add pulls are very aggressive with their aggro radius. Going anywhere near them will trigger the pull, so be sure to hang back and allow your tanks to lead. The first pull involves 2 Griffins and a Voidmaster. One Griffin is at the bottom of the hill, the other roams up and down the path, and the Voidmaster sits at the top of the hill. The Griffins aren't very dangerous, but remember they do cleave, so try to stack them on the Voidmaster, face them away from group, and focus the Voidmaster here. There could potentially be a Paranoxia roaming next that functions the same way we saw in the initial set of trash. The Paranoxia wanders between the first 3 trash pulls, so it really can be anywhere. This add can pull other adds though if aggroed too close to a trash pull, so be ready to potentially integrate the Paranoxia into the next add pull. Just make sure it's facing away from the group if you have to pull it with a trash pack. The second main trash pack gives us our first Disruptor, wandering around the left side, along with a Griffin to the left, a Griffin at the center rear, and a Voidmaster around the corner on the right. This is a pretty dangerous trash pack and can be handled one of 2 ways. You can either stack everything on the Disruptor and attempt to nuke before the enraged circle spawns, or stack everything on the Voidmaster except for the Disruptor and take care of the Disruptor once everything is dead. The third main trash pack involves a Disruptor on the left, a Voidmaster wandering on the right side, and 2 Griffins towards the back. Same concept as the previous pull here, either stack everything on the Disruptor and nuke the Disruptor, or stack everything on the Voidmaster except the Disruptor and take care of the Disruptor once everything is dead. There is another wandering Paranoxia to be aware of between pulls 3 and 4. Same as before, if you pull this add too close to another trash pack, the trash pack will aggro. You can either plan to do this by dragging the Paranoxia into a trash pack, or wait for it to get into an ideal position to pull it solo. The fourth main pull is likely the most dangerous in the trial. This pull involves two disruptors, one of which is to the back left, and the other one wandering between the back left and the right. A Voidmaster and a Griffin to the back right, and a Griffin to the front. This is a pull that you'll want to make sure you have ults for, because you essentially have to kill a disruptor before it enrages everything. There are 3 ways to do this pull. If you're just going for a clear, you can do this in 2 takes. Have one tank pull everything with the exception of a wandering disruptor as far away as possible, and have the group kill the solo disruptor. Then wipe and pull the second disruptor away from group, stack everything else on the Voidmaster, then kill the final disruptor once everything else is dead. The sweaty safe strat involves one tank pulling everything beside the disruptor on the left to the wandering disruptor, and having the group ulti dump nuke the wandering disruptor stack, then turn and finish off the final disruptor once that stack is finished. If your damage is really good, you can stack everything together, ult dump, and just AoE the 2 disruptors before either mech goes out. The final pull involves 2 Voidmasters at the bottom right of the stairs, a disruptor and a Griffin at the bottom left of the stairs, and a Griffin at the top right of the stairs. As with the second and third pulls, you can either stack everything except for the disruptor, kill those adds, then take care of the disruptor, or stack everything together and focus the disruptor before the enraged circle goes out. Remember, at some point randomly, either before, during, after, or in between trash pulls, you will get the mini boss Spiral Descender. It works the exact same way as the first boss, and I would go about handling it as we discussed earlier. This boss fight has one of the coolest designs I've seen of any boss, and also happens to be the easiest boss in the trial. There is a lot going on mechanically, but every mechanic can essentially be negated with a good stack on hard mode, and the mechanics are somewhat irrelevant on regular vet. This fight is broken up into 3 main phases, and depending on your damage, phase 2 and 3 can repeat until the main boss is defeated. Phase 1 begins with a humanoid boss named Archwizard Twelvane. This boss has 17.5 million health on vet and 34.9 million health on hard mode. Phase 1 involves simply defeating this boss. This boss has 3 named basic attacks known as Clobber, Hammer, and Strike. This attack can one-shot a non-tank player. One of the first mechs the boss will do is Coruscating Field, where the boss summons 2 AoEs that initially target a random player. The player targeted will get the same red icon that indicated True Shot on the first boss above their head. The AoEs move very slowly and must be kited away from the group. This mechanic ticks once every second, but ramps up in damage very quickly with each tick, becoming dangerous to even a tank if not handled efficiently. The AoE will change its targeting to chase any player that steps into it over its initial target, meaning if the AoE initially targets player 1, but player 1 lingers for too long in group and player 2 gets hit, the AoE begins chasing player 2. This mech spawns roughly once every 30 seconds. The boss also spawns a series of ice AoEs that fan out from the boss in all directions, called Blizzard. Player's hit will take a little bit of damage and be stuck in place by ice for 4 seconds. You are not stunned and can still do damage, just stuck in place for either 4 seconds or until you roll dodge or break free out of the ice. Circle of Immolation is reminiscent of the mini boss Ansuul in VRG. The boss channels a giant fire donut AoE that does a ton of damage. The ability lasts for 7 seconds, and it's recommended players either stay on the inside of the donut close to the boss in that safe zone to do damage, or simply get far enough away from the boss to get out of it. The boss does not take any other action during this mechanic. The boss will summon an ice donut ring on the player called Ice Cage. It operates much like the Gallonway mech in VCR. Walking into the AoE will result in a pretty hefty tick of damage and slows the player for 2 seconds. Lightning Rod Slam is the boss's heavy attack. The boss winds up her staff and slams it into the tank. This mech can easily one-shot a damage dealer. Simultaneously, multiple lightning AoEs target random players, detonating after 1 second, called Attracted Arc. Anyone caught on these AoEs should survive, but if you get caught in 2 of them, it's a one-shot. Racing Flames isn't really a damage-intensive mech. The boss shoots waves of flames out counterclockwise, seemingly traced by salamander-looking ads. Finally, the boss will summon Firestorm Simulacrum ads roughly 30 seconds into the fight. These ads only have one ability called Firestorm. Much like a Flame Shaper, these ads hurl fireballs at a random group member every 0.5 seconds. The damage isn't too bad, so it's not much of a concern. The ads have about 500,000 health and take a constant 10k damage per second from fiery consumption, so they eventually dissipate on their own. Outside of the puzzle rooms, these don't need any focus. After the humanoid boss is defeated, phase 2 begins. Each player will be assigned a constellation symbol above their heads. There are 3 constellation pads around the room, each dictated by a banner with one of 3 animals that make up a chimera. a lion, Wamasu, and griffin. It doesn't seem that there's a way to guarantee who gets which symbol for this initial phase, so it's suggested players run a heal, just in case you get caught in one of these puzzle rooms without a support. Failure to reach the correct pad in 15 seconds results in a one-shot from a mechanic called Radiance. Once inside the puzzle room, an aspect of the humanoid boss will appear to wreak havoc on players, especially those with no tanks in their room. Each aspect does the same mechanics as the original boss, but based on the animal type. Every shade will do the basic attack, clobber, hammer, and strike. The shade in the lion room will do the fire abilities, that is Circle of Immolation, Firestorm Simulacrum, and Racing Flames. Additionally, the shade will do flare, which is simply a ranged-based projectile light attack. The shade in the griffin room will do the ice abilities, that is Blizzard and Ice Cage. Additionally, this shade will do Ice Arrow, which is simply a ranged projectile light attack. The shade in the Wamasu room will do the lightning abilities, Coruscating Field and Lightning Rod Slam. Additionally, this shade will do Shock, which is simply a ranged projectile light attack. To complete the mechanic, you must solve the puzzle. Depending on difficulty, 3, 4, or 5 crystals will spawn around the room. You will see combat text that reads Control Sequence Initiated. The crystals will begin levitating one at a time with a distinct ring in a certain order. This pattern is always random. Once the crystals have all been shown, the player must destroy the crystals in the pattern showcased. The crystals can only be targeted by light attacks. Failure to replicate the sequence order results in the combat text asterism misaligned. Failure to complete the sequence in roughly 10 seconds will result in the combat text entropic collapse. Once the sequence is completed correctly, combat text will appear reading asterism aligned, and once a room has completed their puzzle, they will be sent back into the primary arena. If any other puzzle room has not been solved, players will be assigned a new symbol and must get to their new pad in 15 seconds, or they will be one-shot by Radiance. This repeats until all 3 puzzle rooms are solved. Once all 3 rooms are solved, it begins phase 3, the Chimera fight. This boss has 46.6 million health on vet and 93.1 million health on hard mode. Phase 3 lasts for 90 seconds, and if the Chimera has not been defeated, will force players to repeat Phase 2 again. Once Phase 2 is completed, the Chimera will respawn again with whatever health it had before retreating. Every 30 seconds, an ad type corresponding with the constellation banners will spawn. Killing one of these ads will assign the respective constellations to the 4 closest players. This means that you can control who gets which constellation for any puzzle phase after Phase 2 has been completed for the first time. Note that constellations seem to be assigned for the first Phase 2 based on instance, as if you wipe on the boss, you will be assigned the same constellation every time you finish Phase 1. The actual Chimera really only has 1 priority mech on vet and 2 on hard mode, but also has a set of mechanics related to each head. The Chimera will do bite, chomp, peck, quick strike, and stab, all of which are its basic attacks, but just depend on which head performed the attack. Its heavy attack is called Maul. Arctic Shred is a mechanic directly related to the tank. The Griffin head breathes a cloud of ice and lays a small target on the location of the tank. The initial attack will do damage with Arctic Blast, but entering or remaining inside of the AoE will do damage with Arctic Shred once per second. Taking damage from Arctic Shred places a debuff on the player for 10 seconds, which increases damage taken to the player. This debuff stacks and refreshes with every new tick, so it's important to get out of this as quickly as possible as a tank especially. The next mechanic comes from the Wamasu head. Lightning Bolt is telegraphed when the Wamasu rears its head and calls down lightning on the target with taunt, as well as a few nearby people. The lightning quickly spreads to all group members and deals damage a second later with attracted bolt in a 3-meter radius. The damage from the AoEs can be shared. One of the primary mechanics the group needs to be aware of is Inferno. The lion head opens its mouth and sweeps a cone of fire in front of it, damaging anyone who is too close every 0.8 seconds, and targeting every player with a meteor. The meteors initially track each person, but will lock onto a location just before hitting the ground. This allows the person to dodge out of the way of the meteor last second, or simply block. Anyone hit by the initial meteor strike, called Sunburst, while not blocking, will be knocked to the ground for 2 seconds. They will have to break free. The meteors leave behind a small AoE as well. Standing in this AoE will result in damage from Sizzling Crater. These AoEs persist until the Chimera is turned to stone. Anyone entering these craters will take ramping damage, ticking every second. Meteors can be stacked a few times even on hard mode without being a problem, but 3 or 4 stacked meteors begins to hurt a lot. The second main mechanic most relevant to hard mode is Chain Lightning. The Wamasu head rears up and lightning gathers in its mouth. A line of lightning connects the Wamasu head with its target, which is the tank, and then to the next 5 closest members from the initial target. This then places a small AoE around each person that detonates after 2 seconds from Chain Circuit. The damage taken from this mechanic scales based off of max health. And it's important to note that these AoEs from Chain Lightning only hit you. As mentioned earlier, a Lion, Griffin, and Wamasu will spawn in 30-second intervals. These are essentially mini-bosses, all of which need to be taunted by a tank. The Griffin ad's basic attack is called Peck or Talon Slice. Its big conal AoE is called Eviscerate, and this can be a one-shot to non-tanks. The Griffin's final mechanic is called Wind Lance, shown when the Griffin lifts its head into the air and spawns a number of AoEs from its center. These AoEs don't hurt much individually, but can hurt if you are too close to the ad and take multiple ticks. The Lion ad's basic attack is called Claw or Rend. This attack also inflicts Hamstrung for 5 seconds, reducing movement speed. Its heavy attack is called Double Strike. Its unique mechanic is Pride's Call, where the lion lifts its head and summons 2 shade versions of itself made of fire. They only have about 250k health on Vet and 600k health on hard mode. The Fire Lions use the Claw and Rend abilities, but do flame damage instead of physical damage. Finally, the Wamasu's basic attack is called Bite. This ad also does Impending Storm, where the Wamasu lifts onto its hind legs and slams back down, sending 8 lightning AoEs from its center, moving in all directions. These AoEs do a lot of damage to players, but they move very slowly, so when you see this happening, back up and allow the AoEs to separate before moving back in. Repulsion Shock is the Wamasu's lightning conal. This only lasts for 3 seconds and is on a 15-second timer, but it does a lot of damage. Finally, Shed Lightning hits all players. The Wamasu slams the ground and all players are hit by 2 bolts of lightning. This boss has a pretty significant change on hard mode that requires you set a certain stack that we'll discuss in more depth in the strategy section. Aside from the more health and more damage aspect of hard mode, the main hard mode changes are as follows. The Archwizard will now summon 3 lightning circles on hard mode instead of 2 on Vet. The puzzle rooms will now have 5 crystals instead of 4. The Lion Mini will summon 3 shades instead of 2, and killing 2 shades results in 3 more spawning as well. The biggest change, however, is the introduction of the Circuit Charge debuff. On hard mode, once Chain Lightning targets 6 players, they are hit by Chain Burst, but also receive the Circuit Charge debuff for 30 seconds. Chain Lightning occurs once every 20 seconds. Taking an additional hit from Circuit Charge while that debuff is already active, i.e. Chain Lightning, results in a 1.5 million damage one-shot. This requires Chain Lightning to be spaced out between 2 groups, much like the Fire Circle on Yolnahkriin and Sunspire. The differences between Vet and Vet hard mode on this fight really only affect Phase 3. For that reason, I'll give a general strategy for Phase 1 and 2, the Vet strategy for Phase 3, and then talk about how that strategy will have to slightly be adjusted for hard mode. Phase 1, despite the vast list of mechanics, is very simple. None of the mechanics have a ton of relevance outside of Get Out of the Red. The main strat adjustments worth mentioning pertain to Core Skating Field and Lightning Rod Slam. On Vet and Vet hard mode, the boss will spawn 2 or 3 AoEs respectively that track group members. The easiest way to handle this is to have the off-tank run through them and kite them away from the group. Since these AoEs move so slowly though, if the group stays put, there's a very good chance that the AoEs will touch somebody else, meaning that the off-tank would lose aggro of them. To correct this, you can either rotate around the statue in the center of the room, as the boss is a melee type boss that will follow the tank quickly. This is a good way to handle the fight for groups with lower damage, as anytime these AoEs spawn, you can simply keep rotating and let the off-tank run through all of the new AoEs. If the group damage is really strong though, you can pull the boss a few steps away from its initial spawn point, allow the AoEs to spawn, then simply move it forward a bit. So the group can follow, the tank grabs the AoEs, and the group attempts to kill the boss before any more of these AoEs spawn. In order to do so, you'd have to kill the boss within 30 seconds. The other mechanic worth preparing for is the Lightning Rod Slam. You want to stay somewhat spread out though, as these AoEs track players, and if you're caught in more than one of these lightning AoEs, you'll likely get killed. The AoEs are pretty small, so you don't have to spread out very much. Some sort of melee range, half moon stack will work fine. Otherwise, this phase of the fight is simple. If it looks bad, get out of it. Phase 2 requires a bit of coordination. Unfortunately, you can't control who gets which constellation at the start, which means a puzzle team could end up without a tank or healer. It's a good idea to have the DDs run Echoing Vigor for this reason. The puzzle rooms that are really helpful to have a tank in are the Lion and the Wamasu, but the Griffin doesn't really do that much damage. If you don't have a support as a damage dealer in a room, just kite the boss for a bit. It's suggested that you all wait to go into the room at the same time, because once a person goes into the puzzle room, the sequence is immediately initiated. One player who does not have aggro of that mini boss should call out, "I will do X room," based on the banner type. For example, if I go into the Lion room, I'll call out, "I will do Lion." I found that there can just be a lot of confusion by having players attempt to do the puzzle together, so it's best to just let one player handle the puzzle and let the other three handle the ad and heal whoever has the ad on them. As a quick note, in the Lion Room, that many will spawn simulacrums. Killing all three of these will cause them to respawn, so DDs not doing the puzzle should try to only kill 2 of the 3 as quickly as possible, just to relieve a little bit of pressure. To solve the actual puzzle, it's helpful to have some sort of numbering system. The entrance to the puzzle room can be dictated by the banner in the room. You should label the first crystal to the left as 1 and simply go clockwise until all crystals are numbered. This is especially easy to establish on hard mode, as the line of 3 crystals will always be 2, 3, 4 left to right, with 1 being left of entrance and 5 being right of entrance. You just have to remember a sequence of numbers and destroy the crystals in the correct pattern. If you're somebody in charge of this mechanic, I'd suggest going to crystal 1, putting your back to it and watching the pattern, listening for the audio cue. If you hear the audio cue but don't see a crystal in front of you light up, it's the one behind you. Phase 3 is the only portion of the fight where vet and vet hard mode may be differentiated. On regular vet, you have 1 tank in charge of the boss and 1 tank in charge of the mini ads that spawn. The group can simply stack on the boss, focus the boss until it turns to stone again, if it does, and then kill ads afterwards. The ads should not be focused until the boss disappears. During the Chimera fight, everybody will get meteors from Inferno. It's really helpful to simply take these as far out of group as possible, giving yourself as much space as you can during the fight. A soft stack is also very helpful, as the group will occasionally get targeted with lightning AoEs that will one-shot players if stacked. Some sort of vast lanes would do well on this fight to stay separated for the lightning AoE mechanics that can be shared and do a lot of damage, but also to kite backwards with meteors. Remember, you can roll dodge out of the meteor AoE before it actually lands. It will target you, follow you, and then set itself after a couple of seconds, allowing you to continue to move out of it once it sets. This allows you to stack meteors with another player or 2 if you decide to do so. Just be careful placing meteors in a pre-existing meteor AoE, as if there are more than 3, it can start to hurt. If the boss turns back into stone, you're going to want to attempt to focus the Wamasu. This is the most dangerous ad to players, and remember, when an ad dies, it assigns a constellation to the closest player, which means you'll likely lose a tank every time. You can separate these ads to control when they're killed, or you can burn them all together and attempt to assign your teams as the ad is dying, by having them stack as close to the ad as possible as its health is reaching 0. I'd suggest having a tank in the Lion and Wamasu rooms and having a healer in the Griffin room. For hard mode, most of this stays the same, with the exception of the stacking. Since Chain Lightning is applied to the tank in the 5 closest people, you'll have to split the stack left and right of the boss. Whenever Chain Lightning is applied to a side, the other tank will have to grab the boss so that their side gets the next Chain Lightning. This does mean that the boss is going to face the group, and the boss does have a fair amount of cleave. This requires your damage dealers to play a bit ranged. Essentially, if the boss is facing your side, you want that side to creep up as much as possible to ensure that they are the 5 closest people to the tank with aggro. If the boss is facing away from your side, you want to play back a bit to ensure that you're not too close to the opposing side's tank. I still recommend either an arc or a house type stack for each side to handle meteors. Those closest to the stone pillar in the center of the room should attempt to stack their meteors against it, and those closest to the pad should attempt to stack their meteors near the pad, with the healers placing their AoEs behind the group in a house stack. Keeping the tank area clear is essential, because when you see Chain Lightning happening, you want to try to get close to your tank. You also want this area clear because a similar AoE not a part of Chain Lightning does stack with other players, and getting hit by 2 of these will kill a non-tank. It's important for DDs to stay a little spread out for this reason, and they need space to do that. As the ads spawn, try to ignore them as much as possible and push the boss. Unless you have insane damage, you will have to do another puzzle phase. It's important to attempt to have preset teams that divide support roles to make the rooms safer, placing a tank in the Lion and Wamasu rooms and a healer in the Griffin room. How you divide your damage dealers should simply be based on who feels comfortable solving the puzzle, though everybody should know how to do it just in case. The trash packs following the first boss introduced 1 new elite ad. Despite the different appearance of the ads we are used to, each elite ad will perform the same set of mechanics. The new elite ad is called a Summoner, a mage type ad with about 4 million health. This ad isn't particularly dangerous and won't be priority over disruptors or enforcers. Its main attack is a projectile called Seeking Rune Scrawl. Tentacular Flail is a cleave type ability that works very similarly to Flail on the Arcanist. This attack targets players with taunt and immobilizes any player hit. Its main mechanic towards the group is called Meteor from Beyond. The Summoner spawns a series of meteors that rain for 5 seconds at about 1 second intervals. These do not do too much damage and can be blocked, dodged, or shielded. Finally, 15 seconds into the fight, the summoner spawns an additional spectral ad. The ad type spawned is random and does not need to be focused, as killing the summoner will despawn the summoned ad. The Demented Brood is one of 3 types, being a Spider Daedra with about 2.5 million health. This ad does the web mechanic, which creates a web with a 4-meter radius that lasts for 15 seconds. Anyone entering the area is snared while in the AoE and for 1 second after leaving it. The second ad type that can be spawned is a Fated Flesh, a Flesh Atro type ad with about 2.5 million health. Its basic attack is called Claw, which only targets the player with aggro and will knock the player back if unblocked. Its main mechanic, Fear of Flesh, is an AoE cast from the ad. When it is initially cast, players are feared and will need to break free. It also does damage after 2 seconds off the initial cast and can be blocked. The ability itself lasts 6 seconds and does damage over time. The final ad type that can spawn is called the Hollow One, a Soul Razor Knight type ad with 2.5 million health. This ad has 3 main mechanics. Pulverize is its heavy attack, and this does apply the Seethe, Rattled, Hindered, and/or Devitalized debuffs. Exploding Charge chooses a random target within 15 meters and does AoE damage upon reaching its destination. This cannot be blocked, but can be roll dodged. Finally, Shield Throw works much like the final boss in Hellra, where the Hollow One throws its shield in front of it, hitting everyone in a 25-meter range. Anyone hit will be stunned and knocked down, but the attack may be blocked, dodged, or shielded. This occurs roughly once every 10 seconds. This set of trash contains far few overall pulls than any of the other sets, in the midst of one of the coolest design zones I've ever seen in a trial. The only pull that can be a little tricky is the final one, but most of what we've already been doing will work well for these ad pulls. The first of 3 pulls contains a Summoner to the left, a Paranoxia in the center, and an Enforcer and Wamasu on the right. Despite being a mage, the Summoner stacks like a melee ad, so everything should be brought to the Enforcer's initial location, and then relocated after the Enforcer teleport and Wamasu charge. Make sure the Paranoxia doesn't cleave the group upon relocation. There is no real priority target here unless you can kill the Enforcer before the teleport. The second pull contains a Summoner to the left by the tree, a Butcher to the middle left, and a Disruptor to the far right. As with any of the previous Disruptor pulls, you can either stack everything on the Disruptor and attempt to nuke before the Enrage goes out, or stack everything but the Disruptor on the Summoner, nuke the ads, and worry about the Disruptor once everything is dead. Between the second and third set of trash will be a single Wandering Paranoxia. This can either be pulled into the second set of trash or handled separately. I would strongly advise against pulling this ad into the final pack though, as there is a lot going on. The final trash pull of the trial contains one of every ad. There is an Enforcer and Wamasu on the left, a Summoner on the back left, a Voidmaster on the back right, a Disruptor mid-ground right, and a Griffin on the front right. This is a lot. I have yet to see a group figure out a way to stack everything together at the same time, especially considering the Enforcer's teleport mechanic. That said though, there are a few ways to do this pull. The safest thing to do is bring everything to the Enforcer, having one tank hold the Disruptor at a group. Since the Enforcer will teleport early, the group can finish the ads brought into that stack point first, kill the Enforcer second, and then handle the Disruptor. The next level of this strategy would involve targeting the Disruptor and attempting to kill it before the Enrage goes out. With this strat, you would bring as many ads as you can to the Disruptor, kill all of those there, then finish any leftover ads later. With this strategy, you would likely have one tank grab the Griffin, Wamasu, and Disruptor, and the other tank grab the Enforcer, Summoner, and Voidmaster. The sweatiest strat I've seen is to bring everything to the Enforcer and kill everything before the Enforcer even teleports or the Wamasu even charges. Limit is built different though. Even with this strat, there is an ad left over as the Summoner doesn't immediately run into group, so you would still have to clean up after the primary stack is finished. The final boss of this trial has some really cool and unique new mechanics and is by far the most difficult fight in the trial on hard mode. On regular vet, the fight is pretty easy, with the first boss likely being a bit more challenging, but hard mode significantly ramps up the damage on all mechs. There really isn't even that much of a difference between the two fights outside of more health and more damage. The more damage part of it though is a lot more damage. As a quick general overview, the fight is sectioned off by intervals of 20%. At 80, 60, and 40%, a maze will spawn that players must navigate through, each being a unique element type. At the end of the maze, there will be a portal in which a tank and 3 damage dealers must enter and kill the boss inside. After the last portal is complete, Ansuul has one more surprise at 20% health, splitting into 3 versions of itself. More about this in a bit. Once all 3 versions of Ansuul are defeated, the boss will recombine for one final push. Getting into the actual mechanics, Ansuul the Tormentor has 70 million health on vet and 160.7 million health on vet hard mode. Phobic Bolts is Ansuul's basic attack attack on the player with taunt. This surprisingly can be blocked by non-tank players and is actually a bit important to know about for a little later on. Calamity is Ansuul's heavy attack. This is a conal AoE that does a ton of damage. Anyone lucky enough to survive this attack will also take a pretty strong dot called Mental Disturbance for 8 seconds. Ansuul also does a much larger, slow-growing cone called Spray. This is not the heavy attack and is actually somewhat survivable, though still recommended to avoid. Rack is one of the main mechanics that affects the group throughout the fight. Ansuul will summon 6 giant lightning AoEs that detonate only 1 second after spawning. Getting hit by this detonation is a near one-shot, and it stuns the player for a few seconds. Players cannot break free from this stun. Each time this AoE detonates, a memory fragment will spawn. More on this mechanic a little later. The Sunburst mechanic will target the player furthest away from the boss. This places an AoE similar to that of the meteors on the second boss with a bit of a quicker spawn time. The AoE will grow for only 2 seconds, at which point its location will be set. Then a meteor crash will follow 1 second later. For an additional 8 seconds after the crash, 5 smaller AoEs will spawn from the primary crater, moving in all directions. Getting hit by any of these AoEs will tick players with damage called Afterburn, which really hurts on hard mode especially. All of these mechanics up to this point operate on a timer. There are 2 mechanics that seem to operate very randomly. The first is called Execute. The boss turns towards a group member and links with them using lightning. If the boss is not interrupted in 1.5 seconds, the targeted player instantly dies. The second is called Wrathstorm. The boss summons a series of small fire AoEs around it. Another large AoE fills up very quickly and must be roll dodged or the player will likely be killed. Anyone hit by either of these AoEs will take damage over time from ignited if they end up surviving. This mechanic is extremely recognizable from the distinct scream the boss does. The smaller AoEs cannot be roll dodged, but the larger ones can be. Finally, one more mechanic worth mentioning operates off of percentage. Every odd percentage, that is 90, 70, 50, and 30%, the boss will use Manic Phobia. This banishes the player with taunt to the furthest corner of the room, spawning a manifestation type ad. The banished player will see a ring with a massive radius around the boss. Entering this ring results in an instant one-shot. The manifestation must be killed before the banished player can get anywhere near the boss. As mentioned earlier, there are 3 different maze types and 3 portals that correspond with each maze. There's a fire maze in portal, a lightning maze in portal, and a poison maze in portal. Each maze has a unique AoE that must be avoided as players navigate through it. Each portal boss has their own set of mechanics, and completing each maze introduces a new mechanic into the fight. Each maze contains an AoE that prevents players from navigating through the maze too quickly, called Mental Barrier. Stepping into Mental Barrier is an instant one-shot. Likewise, if nobody enters the portal at the end of the maze within 50 seconds, Ansuul uses Neural Takeover to wipe the entire group. Neural Takeover will not happen unless 50 seconds from the maze has passed, regardless of portal deaths, unless the portal is closed. For example, if only 2 players go into the portal, they both die, but 50 seconds have not passed yet, more players can still enter the portal, so the boss won't do the wipe mech. However, if all 4 players have entered and have died immediately, since nobody can go into the portal, the boss will do the wipe mech. Getting into the mazes, what they do, and the associated portal and new group mechanics, the lightning maze spawns small circles called Chilling Thoughts that do a ton of damage to players and stun them for a few seconds. You can roll dodge through these AoEs, but they seem to be a little desynced, so I would advise simply trying to move around them. A lot of teams opt to throw a barrier during this maze as well, just to ensure group safety. The stun from this mechanic can be purged. Once the maze is completed, very tiny lightning AoEs will randomly spawn around the boss. These small AoEs are called landmines. Moving into one of these AoEs will result in taking damage from Anxiety's Grip, and apply a slow to the afflicted player for 10 seconds, which will stack and refresh with each additional hit from Anxiety's Grip. Hitting one of these AoEs doesn't hurt too badly, but if you begin to hit them and refresh that stack, the damage will begin to add up quickly. The lightning portal boss is likely the most dangerous of all the portals. This boss has 5.6 million health on vet and 10.1 million health on vet hard mode, and only has a few mechanics. Sparks is its basic melee attack. This attack does additional lightning splash damage in an excessively wide radius, seemingly over 180 degrees. Keeping your distance is the most sure way to survive the mech as a non-tank player. Uppercut is the boss's heavy attack. This boss also does Execute, just like Ansuul. It must be interrupted within 1.5 seconds, or the targeted player will be one-shot. The unique mechanic for this portal is called Conduit. This is an AoE that appears on a player without taunt that ticks for heavy damage for 10 seconds, ticking once every half second. This has a 5-meter radius and ticks anyone inside the AoE in addition to the targeted player. The poison maze spawns a bunch of small boogers that occasionally swell and create a small ring, which afflicts players with Toxic Impression if hit. Toxic Impression does a small amount of damage and significantly slows down afflicted targets. The slow from this mechanic does stack, so getting hit by multiple blobs is a death sentence on hard mode. These can be roll dodged or simply avoided altogether. Once the maze is completed, the poison mine mechanic will begin to randomly spawn on group members. This AoE begins to grow under random players, ticking once every half a second. Anyone in this AoE will take damage from it. There can be up to 2 of these AoEs active at a time, and it's important not to stack the 2 AoEs together. A new person is chosen every 5 seconds, and the AoE lasts for 10 seconds. The damage from this mechanic can also be shared so that the tick is less per player the more players that are in the AoE. However, the difference in ticks are so minimal that doing so is ill-advised. The boss in the Poison Portal, much like the Lightning Portal boss, has a shared mech with Ansuul, a unique portal mech, and the same amount of health. First, its basic attack is called Strike, and its heavy attack is called Defile. The boss also does Blight Burst, where Vanton will hit the tank with an additional tick of damage, followed by a poison dot that ticks for 8 seconds. This boss also does the same spray mechanic that Ansuul does. This cone should be blocked by the tank, as I've heard tanks complaining about the roll dodge timing of this mechanic. Any damage dealer caught in this AoE will be instantly killed. The unique mechanic in this portal is called Corrupt. Vanton turns towards a target and applies a growing AoE on a player. After a second, he sends a blast of poison at them, which should be roll dodged. If the attack lands, anyone in the AoE will also take damage from it, which can be severe. Finally, the Fire Maze spawns AoEs that tick players with Ignite. Much like Fire Bombs on the first boss, taking damage from the roaming AoEs in the fire will cause players to get a small red ring around them that deals ramping damage with Ignite. This can be spread to other players. This damage is not nearly as dangerous as it is on the first boss though, so you can pretty much ignore these AoEs. On completion of the maze, enraged fragments will begin to spawn. More on these adds shortly. The Fire Portal boss operates much like the other 2 in terms of health and mechanics. Hack is its basic attack. This boss also shares both the Sunburst and Wrathstorm mechanics with Ansuul. Wrathstorm in the portal works exactly like it does on Ansuul. A bunch of small fire traps spawn at a medium distance away from the boss, followed shortly by an extremely quick AoE that must be roll dodged. Getting hit by either AoE is a one-shot. Sunburst also works the same way, targeting a player, settling on a location a couple seconds after targeting, crashing a meteor, and then spawning AoEs from the meteor AoE that do a good bit of damage. Throughout the fight, there are 3 main ad types that have been mentioned that I'd like to take a moment to discuss. The memory fragments are probably the most dangerous ads in the fight, especially on hard mode. These are the imp type ads having about 500k health on vet and 1.1 million health on hard mode. The memory fragment's basic attack is called Bolt. This basic attack hits for up to 14k on hard mode, deleting non-tank players if hit by multiple fragments. The enraged fragments are the fire atro type ads that spawn on completion of the fire maze, having about 200k health on vet and 450k health on vet hard mode. These can also get pretty dangerous. Blare is its basic attack and can essentially be ignored. Its Inferno mech, however, is very damage intensive. This ability is channeled for up to 12 seconds, hurling fireballs at players once every 0.25 seconds. This must be interrupted, otherwise players will go down. Finally, the Essence manifestation that spawns when a player is banished at 90, 70, 50, and 30% only has a few attacks. It does do a lot of damage, so it should be held by the tank. Its basic attack is called Talons, which will also occasionally apply the infected wound debuff. This can be purged. Its heavy attack is called Pummel. This ad also has a conal AoE attack called Void Wave that can be very deadly to non-tank players. The last mechanical element of this boss occurs during the split at 20%. The boss will turn into 3 different versions of itself, a fire, lightning, and poison version, with Ansuul's main boss mechanics split between each of these aspects. The blue aspects will do phobic bolts and whack, the green aspect will do phobic bolts and spray, the red aspect will do calamity, Phobic Claws, and Wrathstorm. Every 20 seconds, both the green and blue aspects will use Reposition, which causes them to move away from the player with Taunt, essentially running completely out of stack. Each of these aspects have 3.9 million health on Vet and 8.9 million health on Vet hard mode. Bringing any individual aspect to 0 HP will not change anything about this part of the fight. Only once all 3 aspects are brought to 0% HP will they recombine to make the primary boss, spawning in at about 10% HP. The last mechanical element to highlight are the hard mode differences. As with any hard mode in the game, every mech must be respected to some degree, as the boss has more health and the mechanics do much more damage. In addition to this, Sunburst spawns increase to once every 20 seconds, Enraged Fragments after completion of the Fire Maze spawn once every 12 seconds instead of 16, Poison Mind continues to go out once every 5 seconds in Execute rather than once every 10 seconds. During the maze phase, a mental barrier also appears at the back of the players, forcing them to progress through the maze quickly, but limited in how quickly they can progress by the mental barrier at the front. After the boss split phase is finished, the boss respawns at 20% HP instead of 10% and continues to do the banish mech on a very quick timer. This makes burning the boss in Execute even more important. As with all the bosses up to this point, the hard mode mechanically is not much different from regular Vet. It feels the most different though between any of the other bosses, and the suggested strategies to handle mechs absolutely must be respected on hard mode. For this reason, I'll give tips for the fight on regular vet, then include a section at the end on how these strategies would slightly change for hard mode. Again, the biggest difference is that it's not really the end of the world if you don't respect these mechanics and strategies on vet, but it is a big deal if you do not on hard mode. The fight structure is based around two main mechanics, that is the banish mechanic and the maze and portal mechs. The banish mech occurs at 90, 70, 50, and 30%, and the maze mech occurs at 80, 60, and 40%. This means that the banish mech will likely occur while the portal team is away from group. You can either hold damage and add control while the portal is active, wait to push the banish mech, then have the off tank ready to grab the boss and manifestation whenever the main tank gets banished, or if you want to get a bit sweaty, you can have a healer slot taunt. This boss is very survivable for non-tank players. The healer just needs to make sure that they block the light attacks and roll dodge the heavy. If the taunt swap is done well, the healer should only take a hit or two at the most from the boss, but this is somewhat dependent on damage as well. The mech triggers right between the 1 and 0 percentages, so for example 91 and 90%, so the healer will want to grab the boss right before or right at the 1%. This will allow the main tank to stay on the boss and grab the manifestation. It's up to the group if you want to focus or cleave the manifestation. It's not really that dangerous, and on regular vet, you can simply push the maze and have the portal do the mechanic, while the rest of the group stays and kills the manifestation. Portal is pretty simple if you're aware of the mechanics that can happen. If they are avoided properly, there should only be one mechanic that requires a damage dealer to run a heal. The conduit mech and the lightning portal doesn't tick for too much on regular vet, but it's enough to where it's suggested that players run a heal. Until about 20%, the fight is very simple. Just rinse and repeat these mechs, with each maze adding their own individual mechanic. It's suggested that somebody on the roster, whether it's a healer or a buff DD, run an interrupt. This will allow you to ignore any flame atros that spawn. It's important to note that the maze that spawns is random, so you could, for example, get the fire maze first and then have to deal with the flame atros for the entire fight. Any of these maze mechs reset though when a new maze is pushed. So again, if the fire maze is first, then pushing the second maze will despawn any flame atros, and they will only begin to respawn again once the maze is complete. The mechs reset like this until the final maze is complete, then all the mechs persist until the end of the fight. Depending on group damage, you can simply ignore these for the entire fight if you'd like, but if they are beginning to add up and execute, I would have a flame atro team of 2 damage dealers focus them until the split phase happens. If the atros are all killed and the boss splits, and you have an interrupter, there is no reason they should be an issue between the split phase and end of the fight. The landmines that spawn around the room are a lot like the quote-unquote pimples on the final boss of VAA. The mech itself isn't dangerous, but getting hit with a landmine, plus any other mech, can quickly add up to a 1-2 death. It's advised that support step into these when they spawn to clear them off the field, as they can get really challenging to see with all the giant AoEs that occur in this fight. Finally, the poison mind mechanic is simply just an additional heal check. In general, it's advised that anyone with this growing AoE simply stay put, and that people without the AoE move away from it, much like frost bombs on the first boss. The only time that this gets tricky is during rack. When you're forced to move with this AoE, I'd suggest kiting somewhat away from the group and towards your healer, so the healer can focus you without anybody having to worry about taking additional unnecessary damage during a very mobile mechanic. Some final miscellaneous elements to really worry about above 20%, starting with the manifestations. Remember, these adds spawn from the detonation of each of the giant rack AoEs, and it's essential that the tank gets a hold of them as quickly as possible. Chains now does pull aggro, so I'd suggest simply chaining them in as soon as they spawn. Your tank can also use the Vatishran's sword and shield to assist in this, but it will not reliably pull everything, unfortunately. The sunburst mechanic also should be taken out as far away from the group as possible. Think of this mechanic like core on the final boss of VMAW. The further away from the group you are, the more spread out the sunburst AoEs will be, and the easier these AoEs are to avoid for the group. As soon as this AoE pops up, the player should just book it as far away as they can and continue running until the meteor is locked in on a spot on the ground and the player is out of it. Don't stop and try to block the meteor, for example. It hurts. Finally, the most dangerous and surprising mech at first is Wrathstorm. It's pretty easy to recognize once you know what to listen and look for, but anyone aware that this mech is happening should call it out for the group, as getting hit by any of the small fire AoEs that spawn, and especially getting hit by the main boss AoE, will likely result in a death. The radius of the boss's AoE will only extend to the fire traps, so if you're behind the traps, you're safe. You want to avoid roll dodging backwards, as you'd likely roll into one of these traps. Instead, roll dodge towards the boss. The last strategical element to this fight exists during the split. Both the green and blue shades should be grabbed by one tank, and the red shade should be grabbed by the other tank. The tank range stacking the green and blue aspects should run in a straight line from where all of the bosses spawn, so that whenever reposition happens, they end up walking backwards into the stack on the red aspect. So getting the stack set as quickly as possible is the key to pushing through this portion of the fight. At this point, the group should simply be full committing on the boss and be keeping an eye out for any one shade that has more health than another, so that it can be focused if necessary. Once the boss rejoins, just kill. For hard mode, every mechanic ramps up severely in damage to a somewhat unreasonable extent in my opinion. Most teams are currently getting through this fight by running essentially 4 healers, that is 2 main healers, an off tank with a resto, and a buff crow with a resto. Even this sometimes isn't enough healing to combat all of the damage that's going out if there are any mechanical errors, such as an overwhelming amount of enraged fragments or memory fragments. The first suggested change in strategy would be to focus the manifestation once it spawns. You don't have the option to kill this during the maze because there's a mental barrier AoE in front and behind the group on hard mode. The only ads that persist during the maze are the manifestation and memory fragments, so it's helpful to make sure that these are dead before the maze occurs. You do have a little bit of time to kill them as the maze is spawning, so don't panic per se if the push is close, but just keep an eye on these ads and make sure that they're getting focused. Each maze becomes quite a bit more difficult to clear as well. The fire maze doesn't really matter because you can run straight through all of these AoEs and just get healed through the dot. The poison maze can be deadly if you get caught in a blob explosion. This slows you down tremendously, and getting hit by 1 early on or by 2 at any point almost ensures that the mental barrier chasing the group will catch you. Try to roll dodge through these AoEs so that you don't have to stop moving during this portion. The blobs will only affect you with this debuff if the red ring around them is active. If there's no red ring, the blobs are recharging and will not hit you with anything, but may soon. The lightning maze is by far the most dangerous because not only will getting hit by an AoE stun you for a few seconds, resulting in likely being caught by the mental barrier, but you can also get double ticked for a huge amount of damage by initially hitting the AoE and then being stuck in it for a second tick, resulting in a death. Barrier and or purge is helpful for this maze because roll dodging through these AoEs doesn't feel consistent. I'd only recommend roll dodging through this maze if you don't have any other choice. For the portal, it's strongly advised that all 3 portal DDs run Echoing Vigor. Most of the mechanics can be completely avoided in portals, so portal teams shouldn't really take any damage. The only exception to this is the conduit mechanic in the lightning portal. The best way I've seen this mech handled is by the damage dealers stacking up during this AoE and ensuring that all 3 players hit Echoing Vigor without letting the heal fall off. This is usually plenty of healing for all 3 of them when stacked. You could also send an Arcanist DD with Cascading Fortune to focus the player with the mechanic, but this will be a pretty significant damage loss, which is why I suggest 3 times echoing. Once the maze is complete, the new added mechanic should be respected to some extent. You can opt to either focus the enraged fragments from the fire maze or push the boss to the next maze and rely on the interrupter. Trifecta scenarios would likely call for them to be ignored, that is, until the 40% marker. We'll discuss more about that portion of the fight momentarily, but this is because these ads despawn every 20% once a new maze is active until the final maze is completed at 40%. So if the burn is good enough, only a few of them should ultimately spawn. It is much safer to focus them though until the portal is out, but once the portal is finished, I strongly advise simply pushing the boss. Only 2 or 3 more at most should spawn in that 10% window in an inexperienced group. The landmines that spawn on the ground after the lightning maze will 1-2 a player if hit by any other mechanic. It's essential that support are getting rid of these by popping them, while also being aware of the stacking debuff that ramps up in damage of each landmine hit. Support should also allow that debuff to expire in between popping these mines, especially healers. Once the poison maze is complete, you would handle the poison mine mechanic on hard mode the same way as you would on regular vet. Healers just have to be on top of this mechanic, especially if a player with poison mine has to be mobile during the rack mechanic. In general, stay still with this AoE when you can, get out of this AoE if it's not yours, and try to kite near the healers during rack. It's especially important to get out of these AoEs on hard mode if it's not yours, as this mech will be active throughout the entire fight on 2 players, spawning 5 seconds apart from each other, with the exception of the maze of course. 2 players stacking together will result in double ticks, and this will be a lot of damage. As with regular vet, there are some miscellaneous elements to really worry about above 20%, the first of which are the manifestations. Remember, these ads spawn from the detonation of each giant rack AoE, and it's essential that the tank get a hold of them as quickly as possible. They will light attack non-tanks for 14k apiece. Chains now pulls aggro, so I'd simply suggest chaining them as soon as they spawn. Your tank can also use the Vatishrin, sword, and shield to assist in this, but it won't get all of them unfortunately. The sunburst mechanic should be taken as far out of group as possible. Think of this mechanic like core on the final boss of VMAW. The further away you are from group, the more spread out the Sunburst AoEs will be, and the easier to avoid they will be for the group. As soon as this AoE pops up, the player should just book it as far away as they can and continue running until the meteor is placed and they are out of it. Don't stop and try to block the meteor, for example, it hurts. Finally, the most dangerous and surprising mech at first is Wrathstorm. It's pretty easy to recognize once you know what to listen to and look for, but anyone aware that this mechanic is happening should call it out for the group, as getting hit by any of the small fire traps that spawn, and especially getting hit by the main boss AoE, will likely result in a death. The radius of the boss's AoE will only extend to the fire traps, so if you're behind the traps, you're safe. If you're not, you want to avoid roll dodging backwards, as you likely roll into one of these traps. Instead, roll dodge towards the boss. The biggest change to hard mode revolves around the split phase and what happens after it. Leading up to the split phase, that is, upon completing the 40% maze, I'd suggest putting the damage dealers on ad control. Simply focus memory and enraged fragments until portal team is out, then focus the manifestation with a team of 2 damage dealers running around and killing enraged fragments. I'd recommend these DDs be Arcanists so that they can still reach the boss with their damage while killing the ads. These DDs will have to run a heal though in case they get the poison mine mechanic, so it's not a bad idea for portal DDs to be responsible for this either. Once the portal team is out, the group should push out and focus the manifestation, with the exception of the enraged fragment DDs. Once the manifestation is dead, the group can push to the split phase. Whether or not you continue to have the enraged fragments focused by that group of 2 is up to how comfortable your team is with the fight. If you're just starting out, I'd suggest having these fragments focused until the split phase is finished. This will be completely dependent on how quickly your tanks can stack them. Remember, one tank should grab the blue and green aspects and sprint into the corner of their choice, while the other tank brings the red aspect to that stack. Once this phase is finished though, the DPS race begins. The banish mechanic begins on a 20 or 30 second timer from 20% on. As soon as the boss reforms, you'll want a healer to taunt the boss instantly so that they're banished, and the group just needs to nuke the boss before it happens again. You have to continue respecting all of the mechs up to this point though, so don't get tunnel vision. This is the most difficult part of the fight. Thank you so much everybody for checking out the video. If you're new to the channel, do me a huge favor, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comment section below if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. I'll be sure to get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Likewise, I'm on Twitch, Twitter, TikTok, and Patreon, so be sure to shoot me a follow on those platforms as well. It would be much appreciated. A special shout out and thanks to all of my current patrons, Clyde, Reef, Flug, and Dragon. Thank you so much for your support. It's because of you that this type of content is made possible. Truly from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much, my friends. And thanks to all of you as well for all of your love and support. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you in the next one.